Here.
Morning, Adam. It is
Morning.
my honor today to introduce Adam Olsen, a courageous leader and former MLA for Saanich and the islands from 2017 to 2024. During his time as MLA, Adam was known for his work in environmental protection, Indigenous rights, and climate change policy. A particular note for us here on the islands was his advocacy to have the five Southern Gulf Islands included in the Island Coastal Economic Trust to be designated rural, which is many of us are struggling that. I know Souk is, and I know that Bowen Island is struggling to become rural. So I want to also note that Adam is a proud member of the Tsarslip Nation. He currently serves as the lead negotiator for the Tsarslip, representing the nation's interests on land and resource management, governance, and the treaty land entitlement process. His leadership and negotiation plays a crucial role in advancing the nation's rights and self-determination. Adam's expertise at bridging gaps between environmental concerns, Indigenous rights, and sustainable development makes him a true champion of the greater good. We are grateful for his service and for his time with us today. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Francine. Sa hanap tinit today. Just net Saanich Tsarslip lang. Sewi suit tana main. Sikwa itel quilam tana sitla. Good morning. My name is Sahanap Adam Olsen. As many of you will know me, I am Saanich from the Tsarslip village. My father is Sewisut. His name's Carl Olsen, and my late grandparents are Tsikwat, Laura Olsen, and Telquilam, Ernie Olsen. And it's an honor to be here working from my home in the village of Tsarslip in the Saanich territory. It's an honor to be here with you this morning. I want to acknowledge the territories of my relatives throughout the Straits, from south of the San Juan Islands through to Southern Gulf Islands, through to the islands in the Northern Straits. These spaces have been stewarded by my relatives and our ancestors since time immemorial. I raise my hands to the organizers, the brains and muscles of the Rural Islands Economic Partnership. I've always appreciated how you've kept the economic well-being of the rural islands centered in your work. At this moment, we're all facing extraordinary economic times. We're confused by the actions of our neighbor, concerned about the future of this territory, and because it is unprecedented, it's difficult to visualize and plan for what may be next. Whatever may unfold in the next few weeks and months, I believe our short, medium, and long-term success is contingent on the resilience of our relationships with each other. While some celebrate this term economic reconciliation, I argue that this catchy little phrase remains incomplete to our collective responsibility to First Nations and to our own Canadian identity. Reconciliation cannot be selective. It must be comprehensive, addressing land, governance, and economic sovereignty together. It is important to ground our discussion today in the fact that for the Saanich, the rural islands that we know as the Gulf Islands today, the San Juan Islands, are our relatives. Our transformation stories show how the creator Geelts transformed our relatives into Teichis, the Senchofan word for islands, meaning relatives of the deep. These are the words of my relative Penach, David Elliott, as some of you may know him, describing an image he'd created for the Teichis revitalization project. It helps with understanding the familial relationship the Saanich people have with these spaces and the responsibility we have to look after each other. David says, or Penach says, this Elananok homeland image refers to a story of the creation of our homelands here in Saanich. In the story, we say that the Creator made our homelands, the islands, Teichis, and high mountains from stones he cast. The stones, however, were actually people who emanated good qualities that the Creator believed we should all have. The Creator told the islands as he cast them outward, take care of your relatives. In the image, the Creator speaks to one of the islands before he casts them out, while the human form appears in the stone that is suspended in midair and an island emerges from the water opposite the Creator. End quote. In February 1852, our Saanich ancestors were beginning to feel the effects of increasing settlement and the threat of colonization. Forests were being cut, and the slash was burned against our traditional way. Additionally, a messenger was shot and killed crossing a newly fenced field that blocked an ancient path between villages. Satanich family heads met with the Crown's representative and Hudson's Bay man, James Douglas. Together, they made a peace treaty. The words later written in the document protect the rights of Satanich to continue hunting on unoccupied territory and to carry on our fishery as formerly. These rights have been tested in court, successfully tested in court. Bartleman, Ellsworth, Claxton versus Saanich and Bay Marina, and Morris and Olsen. Had our treaty been honorably implemented, it would have protected the Satanich right to economic sovereignty. Our fisheries were the backbone of our economy, but the Satanich were excluded from the fisheries. And now, due to government mismanagement and industrial greed, the salmon, herring, and shell fisheries have been devastated on our coast and in our territory. The colonial project here in Canada systematically excluded First Nations people from the economy and tethered us to government programs and services. The results are dramatic. First Nations communities face the widest socioeconomic gap and the deepest infrastructure deficits of any community in our country. Here's a key point from my comments today. Because of this history, I challenge the rhetoric of economic reconciliation used by some politicians in gaining in social popularity. It suggests some type of progress while ignoring the deeper structural issues that exist. First Nations of these rural islands that we're talking about deserve to have both a meaningful economy and a governance system that reflects their values. True reconciliation requires action in all areas, not just where it's comfortable or convenient, but also, let's be honest, it's not like the economic reconciliation that we're talking about is generating any noticeable wealth for First Nations in this region. Understanding this story is crucial to discussing what true economic inclusion should look like. Reconciliation requires recognizing rights and implementing them through First Nations self-determination. Self-determination requires self-reliance that First Nations must achieve through economic sovereignty. We will meet those needs through a variety of means: land back for community needs and economic developments, business development, and co-governance models with other government and non-government organizations. Collectively, we must change how we see and relate with First Nations. I'm not talking about a gift that the rest of society or the governments that represent us give First Nations. I'm talking about a basic expectation of respectful interpersonal and intercommunity relationships. We need to move beyond the idea of simply engaging or consulting. While formal contact may be necessary, the real goal should be building genuine relationships. We need to stop thinking about it as generosity because it's about what is right. From an ethical perspective, it is immoral for our governments to keep First Nations communities tethered to systems we know create desperation and toxicity. From a legal perspective, it's what is fair and just based on Western law. From an economic perspective, it makes absolutely no sense to exclude First Nations people and impoverish their communities. Governments know what the problem is. Negotiators, like me in my new role, politicians, our chiefs and councils, and our band administrators raise the issues in every meeting. We tell them that we lack the resources to deliver social services and build and maintain the physical infrastructure our communities, First Nations communities, need. We lack the land, financial capital, liquidity, and regulatory framework. In addition, we are smothered by generations of dysfunction that is the result of the Indian Act governance and land management structures. My First Nations relatives from the southern to the northern rural islands have deep relationships with the lands and waters surrounding them. The coastal people are marine people. Through the 20th century, those relationships have been intentionally broken by colonial era policies, and they have been maintained until today. Increasingly, my relatives are reconnecting in the relationship with the islands and the amazing people who live there. There's a new receptivity and desire from islanders to learn about the history of those spaces. But it needs to be more than sparse economic tokenism. Your community island economies will be much more resilient when First Nations people are invested back in the islands, participating in the economy of the islands, stewarding the terrestrial and marine environment, improving the commons. But acknowledgement alone is not enough. If we stop there, we are merely performing reconciliation, not living it. I've often spoken about land acknowledgements. In these coastal communities, it is important. We see the ancient evidence of First Nations societies and cultures. There are hundreds of village sites across the islands and the straits. Many of them have been disturbed, covered by pavement, concrete, and glass. Acknowledging the land and its relationship with Indigenous people is not just symbolic. It recognizes rights and title, rights that colonization, the Indian Act, and ongoing policies continue to disrupt. We must align our words with actions by changing our relationships with the land and water and the Indigenous peoples connected to them. It's not far enough to do a land acknowledgement without action towards some form of restitution. Otherwise, it just becomes performance art. There are many ways that we can co-create meaningful relationships through revenue sharing, land trusts, such as the Osatnich Land Trust Society, and co-management agreements in parks and other spaces. From an economic perspective, rural island economies should be linking up in joint ventures and other business arrangements with First Nations enterprise, making charitable contributions, and developing collaborative agreements to manage and steward the terrestrial and marine environments together. Relationships are the foundation of strong communities, strong economies, and strong governance. They're not built through transactional meetings or legal checklists. They're built through trust, reciprocity, and respect. Yet, for generations, our governments have applied a different standard to Indigenous rights. Instead of recognizing First Nations as partners, they've treated us as obstacles, something to be consulted rather than engaged with as decision makers. This mindset has led to generations of exclusion, instability, and broken trust. Legally, the duty to consult comes from HIDA in 2004. It requires the Crown to consult Indigenous peoples when their rights may be affected. But consultation is not consent. Consultation is not partnership. It is a legal minimum, not a meaningful relationship. Free, prior, and informed consent, recognized by British Columbia's Declaration Act and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, set a higher standard, one that acknowledges Indigenous peoples as right holders, not just stakeholders. So I ask, why do we accept consultation and accommodation when we expect consent and mutual agreement in every other aspect of society? Why should First Nations be the only people in Canada who are expected to accept decisions being made about their lands, waters, and future without their full and informed agreement? This is why we must shift our thinking from obligation to true partnership. Instead of asking, have we fulfilled our duty to consult? We should be asking, have we built a relationship based on trust and mutual respect? Instead of checking a box, we should be forging partnerships. Because true reconciliation is not about fulfilling obligations, it's about doing what's right. So let's move beyond consultation and move toward relationship. This presentation has shared ideas that can help your business and community become more resilient in these turbulent economic times. This is the moment for Canada to move past the restrictions of the Indian Act through truth, recognition, and a reconciliation of the history and land resource exploitation that has happened on British Columbia's coast since the mid-1800s. I challenge this notion of economic reconciliation because it does not recognize the structural and systemic dysfunction created and maintained by Crown governments. To repeat what I said earlier, reconciliation requires recognizing rights and implementing them through First Nations self-determination. Self-determination requires self-reliance that First Nations must achieve through economic sovereignty. Economic integration is essential, and the reconciliation cannot be selective. Recognizing the land and acknowledging First Nations presence is a step toward restoring the original order. But economic inclusion is a step, not the destination. We must go beyond land acknowledgements, beyond consultation, beyond what is comfortable. True reconciliation means returning land, restoring governance, and forging relationships built on mutual respect. So my challenge to you is this: start today. Build real relationships with First Nations people, not as a duty, but as an obligation to justice. First Nations are not asking for gifts. We're seeking what is right, and I'm inviting you to stand with us. Thanks for seeing.
Thank you.
Adam. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Francine.
No, it's Hachka, Adam. It's powerful, and thank you. So now, Mitch.
Now we would like to open it up to some questions for Adam. If you'd like to raise your hand, and we'll take 5 minutes of questions, and then we're going to move into breakouts to discuss what Adam has shared, talk about it, and talk about what that means for us in our own communities. So, do we have any comments or questions?
Mark Vonich has his hand up. Mark Vonich.
Hi,
Yeah,
thank
Mark, go
you.
ahead.
Thank you, Adam. As a local government representative, one of the challenges I see is how to bring First Nations who have not signed treaties into the decision-making process of the boardroom. And there has been conversation around the government allowing First Nations to have decision-making power at the boardroom before they've signed the treaty, but that hasn't happened yet. I just wanted your comments on that.
Yeah, I would say that thank you for your question, Mark, and I'll just say that I have long complained about the fact that the Local Government Act, the Islands Trust Act, lots of provincial acts fail to acknowledge the Declaration Act, and that's part of the work of implementing the Declaration Act is going to be to ensure that all of those other acts are in alignment. However, I think that we can do two things at once, and I encourage local governments to open their minds up to this. I know the lawyers of local governments will tell you that there is no responsibility that local governments have, that's a Crown responsibility. And I would say that the Local Government Act or the Islands Trust Act isn't the only act that guides your actions as a director, as a locally elected politician. Every act, in fact, that's passed in British Columbia is applicable or could be applicable to what you're doing, and that includes the Declaration Act. So it's going to take local governments to move out of a mindset, I think, that they're doing something extraordinary by engaging with First Nations people in relationship, but it's indeed the only way that you're going to be successful. And I would say that local governments that figure this out are the ones that are able to self-actualize. The ones that aren't are going to be limited. Their neighbors are going to be limited and only able to deliver a fraction of what's possible once true partnership happens, true relationships happen.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, for that question. We have a question from Emily. Or Tim. I see Tim's been spotlighted already. So let's go to Tim and then Emily.
Thank you, Adam. And my question is following similar lines. Islands Trust Council has made a request of the province to review the act and the governance structure, and specifically a question around aligning the act with DRIPA. Currently, certainly what we hear lots is there's a desire for First Nations to be at the table in a meaningful way. So this is just more a question of advice. How do you think that the local governments should be approaching the province with that kind of work so that we not only have the aspirational but the jurisdictional reality to have those voices as an integral part of our local governments?
I'm gonna shift the primary relationship because this is the relationship between the Islands Trust and First Nations people that I think is the key one. I think that your success with the province will come once the Islands Trust is truly able to stand with the First Nations alongside each other as partners in this project to the provincial government. And I think that the provincial government is likely to be able to continue to push back on the Islands Trust until that local work is done. And I think that what I find so often is that, and what I found actually in my retirement, is a lot of organizations want me to come in and do First Nations engagement for them. And I am actually pushing back on that, and I'm offering instead to have just hopefully useful conversations with those organizations about how they can build relationships with First Nations people.
Right.
And I can be a safe place to bounce ideas off of, and they can take those ideas or not. But it is primarily the Island Trust, and I just use the Island Trust as one example here. Every municipal government, every other government agency, they can always look to the Crowns to dispense the duty to consult, but the duty to have a relationship is on each and every one of us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam and Tim, for your questions. So we've got Emily next, and then we've got Dwayne, and I think we're going to cut it off on those last two questions. So go ahead, Emily.
Gila Casa, Adam, thank you so much for laying it out so clearly for people. Sometimes I also, as an Indigenous woman, get asked these same questions, and I just love how clearly that you laid it out there. It is on each individual, and I just kind of wanted to put out there, as an Indigenous woman who has sat through quite a few land acknowledgements, I want to put a challenge out there to the rest of the people in this room, that's a really great basic first step, but I believe that we're past that now. And what I would really love to hear is what you are doing as a human being and what your organization is doing to further reconciliation. What positive steps are happening beyond a land acknowledgement? That's what I would really love to hear. Yeah, thank you, Adam.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah,
totally agree with that. Absolutely. Just leave
great.
it at that.
And yeah, and a great discussion starting point for when we go into our groups about what you can do meaningfully beyond a land acknowledgement in your communities. Thank you. We have one more question here from Dwayne.
Yeah. Chichi emotes Quagan Adam for sharing your knowledge. It was a really eloquent introduction into braiding your intellectual approach and ingenuity towards looking at economic reconciliation. So I'm grateful for that. I had to write a few things down, but that's excellent. In terms of, I'm looking at, I'm sort of thinking it in terms of your sharing, how you've shared Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing out on the land. In terms of, I fully understood the I guess the holistic approach of this learning that I think that you've incorporated into the economic, social, cultural, and political sort of braiding and interpreting of that, because that's kind of fundamentally what the common interests in terms of negotiating lands and monetary value in terms of moving towards, I guess initiating and tools like UNDRIPA. What I had my most recent experience on for the first time ever sitting on the same side of the table as the federal government in terms of looking at working with species at risk, that I had found that a lot of government at all levels of government, of the hierarchy, that they had lacked to understand or even acknowledge what's subjective and what's subjective to Indigenous peoples occupying their territory. And I know that there's a provincial and federal action plan on looking at trying to move forward on kind of instead of thinking this pan-Indianism. I mean, you also mentioned the impacts and interruptions of the Indian Act, but this pan-Indianism I'm feeling that with our current, like when you mentioned the Indian Act, where we're talking about pan-Indianism, where we have our elected leaders sort of objectively utilizing a cultural Indigenous knowledge and cultural people just to basically accommodate what they're doing of the day. So I mean, I think there's really needs to be a formal conciliation instead of reconciliation. I'm thinking in terms of to be able to look at from an Indigenous perspective of what's in terms of self, family, community, nation. I think that's a Cree philosophy. I'm looking at the possibility of developing a meaningful path towards having the cultural competence to be able to envision
There's
what we all want to see out on the land in terms of management, in terms of protection. So
there's a piece here, Dwayne, that you mentioned about action. You mentioned action plans. And I think in
yeah,
the context of this conversation, what I hope to be able to leave with everybody is that action plans are great in terms of being able to achieve some stated objectives, but they are not relationship building documents. They are the individual actions that you can account for. And
Mm.
so we often look to governments to implement their action plans. I've been calling on the government to implement the action plan for reforming the Police Act for the last 3 years, 2 years, 3 years.
Mm.
And it's just a series of actions. What I'm hoping for is, and what I'm inviting everybody individually here to participate in, is relationship building. And I think that actually going and building genuine relationships, transforming from transactional relationships to these transformative relationships of people getting to know each other and being able to operate in spaces with each other, and the action plans are going to be great. However, I think that it's also important to acknowledge that we each have a responsibility in this as well. Hi, Chisiam.
Yeah,
Thank you
yeah.
for this opportunity to
Yeah, thanks.
thank you for this opportunity to hang out with you, and
No,
really
that's why.
raise my
Thank you.
hands to the Rural Island Economic Forum. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Dwayne, and thank you once again, Adam, for sharing your words, for sharing your inspiration. Francine, anything you'd like to say
No,
in closing
just
of this session?
Hachka, Adam, be well. Take care.
Mm.
Thank you very much. We love you.
Thank you again, Adam. Yeah, thanks for joining us.